Welcome to Woodhaven. Come along with me as I take a trip through the Woodhaven countryside using my digital camera to snap photos during the fall of 2002. The house is oriented so that it faces towards the east, and here we're looking at the front of the house and looking generally towards the north. And beyond the house you can see a large field. Sometimes that field has had corn planted in it, sometimes it's been a hay field, and sometimes it's been full of weeds. Wait a minute. Sometimes it's full of wildflowers. Of course, you know that one man's weeds are another man's wildflowers. After reviewing some of the records in the Perry County Courthouse nearby, my best guess is that the house was built somewhere around 1836. The courthouse records don't really show when houses were built, but they do show when property changed hands and the price of the property at that time. And based on the changing price when the house was sold from one party to the other, 1836 seems the best guess. The original two-story part of the house still has the original slate roof. Most of the changes that have been made since Diana and I acquired the house in 1987 have been to the exterior. We've also done quite a bit in cleaning up the yard and building trails in the woods. This shows what the house looked like in the summer of 1987. The small front porch was peeling away from the wall of the house, and the floor was wooden with cavities underneath where critters like groundhogs and snakes could live. The mortar between the bricks needed to be tuck-pointed, and the windows were loose and broken and were in pretty bad shape. So, as you can see, we've attacked the exterior and done quite a bit to it, including a couple of additions. The original house, at least as we inherited it, had a outside porch on the south side that was open to the weather, and several layers of porch floors had rotted away, and it was kind of dangerous. And there had been originally a similar porch on the northwest side of the house, which someone in the past enclosed and turned into a bathroom. However, when they did that, they did not put in a proper footing or a proper septic system. So one of the first things that we did was Steve and I tore down the old porch and the old bathrooms, and then I contracted to have a proper foundation put in, and we actually extended the foundation north of the old bathroom, the old outside porch turned into a bathroom, so that we could add a bedroom there, and we also made a little extension so that eventually we could add this two-car garage that you see in this picture. A couple of years ago, Diana came home with a big plastic bag in her trunk, and it was full of plants that she had gotten from one of her friends who was thinning out their garden. And I brought them out to Woodhaven and dug a trench along the side of the garage, put in some good soil, and successfully propagated the plants. These plants belong to the family called sedum, or also sometimes known as stonecrop. And they're really quite lovely in late summer when they're in full bloom. Here we've moved around to the back of the house, and from here you can see the back porch, or what I call the south porch, that replaced the original outside shed roof porch that was rotting away. The row of windows in this enclosed porch face the south, and they're situated such that on June 21st, when the sun is high in the sky, the sunlight barely gets inside the porch. However, on December 21st at noon, the sun is far to the south, and it beams in and shines about 3 feet up on the back wall of the porch. Now, inside the porch is a concrete floor and a concrete ledge all the way around the original foundation of the house. Has about 7 cubic yards of concrete, and this acts as a passive solar collector. And I've had flowers out here on this porch all year long without any heat on the porch except for the sun, and only 1 year in the last 10 have the flowers actually frozen. Just inside the large glass doors is a old swivel rocking chair, and that's my seat where I sit and watch the seasons change. We've turned our backs on the house and walked across the yard until we come to the frog pond. A couple of summers ago, Steve took his summer vacation and spent it at Woodhaven, and he decided to play with the Big Blue tractor, which is pretty unresistible for most guys, and he was practicing with the front loader and the backhoe, and he dug this hole that became the frog pond. The hole fills up and stays filled with water naturally. It was kind of a wet area in the edge of the yard to start with. Although it was pretty late in the summer when the frog pond filled with water, before long it was full of tadpoles, which turned into frogs, and they jump all over the place as you approach the banks. When the frog pond was first built, it was just a muddy mess, but within a short time Mother Nature took over and planted all sorts of interesting things there, including cattails, different kinds of grass, and a variety of wildflowers. I thought it would be kind of fun to have some water lilies growing in the frog pond, and I noticed at a local building supply center that they had some on sale that were pretty expensive in my opinion, $10 each. And so I kept going back all summer long and waiting for them to have a big sale, and they never did. But then late in the summer, I went to the place where the water plants were stored, and they were all gone. But right at that spot, I saw a forklift, and on the forklift was sitting a man munching a slice of pizza. So I said to the man, "What happened to all the water lilies?" And he said, "Oh, we moved them over there in the corner." And I said, "Well, are you going to have a big sale on them?" And he said, "We're getting rid of them. I'll give you as many as you want for 25 cents each." So I bought a dozen of them, and I put several in the frog pond, and put the rest of them down in Horseshoe Lake. The water lilies came in small pots, and I had to transplant them into larger pots before planting them in the pond. And if you look real close, you can probably see a couple of small leaves from one of the pots of water lilies that have showed themselves in a frog pond. And now I can hardly wait till next summer to see how many of them survive. One of Diana's friends was visiting a garage sale one day, and at the garage sale they had this chair. But it was kind of rotting away and wasn't very trustworthy, and so they were giving it away. And Diana's friend said, "That would look nice at Woodhaven." So they picked it up and gave it to us, and it does look kind of nice here next to the frog pond. But if you weigh more than 50 pounds, I wouldn't sit on it if I were you. Well, now we're going to go a little to the left of the chair, down over the bank, and we're going to go into the meadow, but we'll stop and look at the salt block first. On the edge of the meadow, I keep the salt block at this place, and the deer and other wildlife need salt in their diet, and they like to come here and give it a lick. And at this point, the salt block that started out as a big 50-pound chunk of salt is now licked to almost nothing, and so it's just about time to get a new one. If you look really close in the sandy soil near the base of the salt block, you can almost always find some fresh deer tracks. And if it's a little wet, you might also see some tracks from raccoons or groundhogs or other critters. The salt block is located such that when I sit in my rocking chair on the south porch, if a deer comes by to lick on it, I can catch a glimpse of them. If you stand at the salt block and look generally towards the west, you'll see the pole barn. Before we visit the pole barn, we're going to stop at the edge of the meadow, and at this point you're supposed to go ooh and ah over my baby hemlock tree. Now it turns out there are not a lot of hemlocks growing naturally in Ohio. There are a few in some of the valleys in the Hocking Hills that were left from there by the glaciers that ground through this area 18,000 years ago. But where I grew up around Kane, Pennsylvania, there are a lot of hemlocks. As a matter of fact, hemlock is a Pennsylvania state tree. And in a fit of nostalgia, one afternoon when I was hiking around my old haunts in the woods near Kane, I pulled a couple of hemlock tree seedlings up by the roots, stuck them in a plastic shopping bag, and transplanted them, and this one has survived to become about, 1.5 feet, 2 feet tall. My dream is that someday this hemlock tree will turn into one of those majestic 100-foot tall specimens that are found in the Allegheny Highlands. Here's a view of the interior of the pole barn. And pole barns are one of the less expensive ways to shelter farm equipment or just shelter space. And they're built by sticking a bunch of poles in the ground, in this case 4x6 pressure-treated lumber. And once those poles are planted and plumbed, lattice work of boards is put around, a roof is added, and then the whole thing is covered on the outside by sheet metal, and it provides a very nice way to shelter the little red tractor and the big blue tractor that you see here. The big blue tractor is probably one of my more extravagant toys. As a matter of fact, it represents my birthday and Christmas presents for the rest of my life. But it's a serious tractor, not large by farm tractor standards, although in that business it's considered a compact tractor, and it is capable of doing some serious work. I had it come with a front loader and a backhoe, and in this picture you see that the backhoe has actually been removed. Farm tractors come with something on the back called a three-point hitch, and it's a standard arrangement for connecting all kinds of equipment. In this case, you attach the backhoe by backing over that frame and then hooking the frame onto the tractor with a couple of pins. Aligning the holes with the pins to get them in is not a trivial job, but fairly straightforward. Then you attach the hydraulics, and then the backhoe is capable of digging. With the backhoe removed, I've put something on here called a brush hog. And the brush hog also attaches to the three-point hitch, but instead of using hydraulics, it has a drive shaft that's attached to the power takeoff, and there's a big rotary blade underneath the brush hog that acts like a giant lawnmower, and it's used for cutting high grass or even small saplings and brush. And those are some of the things that you'll find hidden inside the pole barn. And to provide a little orientation as to where we are now on our tour, the pole barn is in the meadow to the west of the house, and if you look through the trees, you can just barely make the outline of the house out. Now we're going to turn our back on the pole barn and head on towards the west, down towards Horseshoe Lake. As we follow the trail down towards the lake, we come to this area I call the moss garden. And there's this very nice covering of green moss. Actually, the color of the moss changes depending on how much moisture has come down recently. The wetter it is, the more emerald green the color is. But this particular spot makes me recall a poem by Robert Frost.
Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth, then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had warned them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference.
Well, in this case, it doesn't really matter which road you take, because before long they both lead to the brown bench. And if you sit at the brown bench, you'll get a nice view of Horseshoe Lake. The lake that you see is actually the result of some old coal mining activity. Back in the 1940s and 50s, southeastern Ohio was full of strip mining, and in those days they did not have to do any reclamation work like they have to do now. Today they're supposed to put the land back exactly how it was before they started mining, but in the 1940s and 50s they would put their big shovels in and they would dig along the hillside, dig to where it got too deep to get the coal out easily, throw all the dirt behind them, and leave an ugly, dirty trench. Well, Mother Nature does a great job of reclamation, and Mother Nature has come in and fixed up this area, and she sent a family of beavers in to build a couple of beaver dams on either end of this curving section of trench, and the result is Horseshoe Lake. And in the last 40 years or so, a lot of trees have grown up, and it's really quite a pleasant sight from the brown bench. Well, let's get up from the brown bench and take a little walk towards the left and then back around and follow this trail down into the gully. The trail from the brown bench down to the lake level was my first trail building experience, and it was quite a challenge because there's about an 80-foot elevation change, and the hillside is fairly steep. So I took my grub hoe and hacked into the hillside and made this trail, and it required a switchback. And a couple summers ago when Steve was on vacation, he came out and worked on this trail quite a bit and improved it because it had deteriorated some over the years. As you go around the switchback and head on down towards the lake, in some spots it gets fairly steep. And for that last 15 feet or so, I had to construct a ladder to use to get down over the bank. A number of years ago at Ohio State University, they were doing some remodeling of our engineering drawing laboratories, and they dismantled what were some large teaching platforms, and I was there one day and found that they had thrown the framework for these platforms in the Dempster dumpster. And so I couldn't resist rescuing some of the steel parts, and eventually I repurposed these parts, and that's what I used to build this ladder. So it's hard to tell that this ladder was actually part of a teaching platform at one time, but it's really held up over the years. And it helps us get down to the next level, which is close to the water. Now we're down to the level of the lake, and although late in the summer there's a lot of tall grass and wildflowers growing here, traditionally we call this area the beach, because some years ago, especially when we had the heat wave in the summer of '88, we used this area for accessing the water to go swimming. And believe it or not, the water was fairly warm. And it was occasionally exciting. Diana was cruising around on an air mattress one time here, and a beaver came out and started cruising around her air mattress, and she was worried that it would come with its giant beaver teeth and cut a hole in her air mattress, and she would go water skiing all around the lake. Well, that never happened. But the beaver swimming around her air mattress did happen. In the beach area, you can find a variety of different wildflowers, and the kind of wildflowers that are blooming depend on the exact time of year you visit there. In late summer, you can see a few of these flowers still blooming. These flowers are known as lobelia, and they're this nice bright blue color, and in the late summer they're one of my favorite flowers. Of course, it seems that every time I stop to admire another flower, it becomes my favorite of the moment. This flower is called jewelweed. Jewelweed prefers to grow in moist areas, and it's pretty common along the edge of the lake all the way around. Jewelweed has one very interesting application. The stems of the jewelweed are very fleshy and full of juice, and if you ever run across poison ivy and you get an itchy rash, you can crush the jewelweed stems and spread the juice over the rash, and the itching will be relieved, and eventually the poison ivy will go away. Directly across the lake from the beach is the island, and if you look closely in the locust tree on the island, you'll see a box. It's actually a duck box, and this was a school project of Steve's some years ago. Although it's been there for a while, I've never really seen ducks going in and out of it, but I have seen a lot of wood ducks on the lake, especially when their young ones are out cruising around all in a line behind the parents. They're one of the most spectacularly colored birds that we have in North America. This is a view from the beach area, looking towards the right as you face the lake, or actually looking towards the north, and that's where we're going to go next. However, the edge of the water line here is much too steep. It even becomes cliff-like in places, and we can't walk along this edge, so we're going to have to retrace our steps back up the hill and then get back down to the water level in another location. So we made it back up the hill to the brown bench, and from here we'll go back through the moss garden, only this time we're going to stay closer to the lake. Actually, we're going to follow the cliff along the edge of the lake, and eventually we'll get to the white bench, another nice overlook spot. Whoa, what do you think happened to this big oak tree that stands on the edge of the cliff overlooking the lake? Well, a lightning strike is what happened. Now, usually when lightning strikes a tree like this, you find a long strip of bark peeled away from the upper part to the lower part of the tree, But in this case, the tree was completely shattered. My theory is that there must have been a pocket of water or moisture in the center area of the tree, and when the lightning hit it, it flashed into steam and exploded and blasted this tree all over the place. The impact of this lightning strike was so powerful that the whole top part of the tree was knocked right over the edge of the cliff and lays precariously close to falling into the water. I've never seen such a dramatic example of a tree getting hit by lightning. Now we've moved along a little farther past the lightning-stricken tree till we come to the white bench, and this provides yet another overlook of the lake. If Spot the dog had a digital camera tied onto her head, this is about what you would see from her perspective. Here we're looking generally towards the west along the north arm of the lake. Behind the white bench you find this trail that leads back to the house, but on this tour we're not going to go back to the house yet. Instead, we'll follow another trail that I built that leads down into another little valley and goes around and back and forth until we get back down to the water again. Eventually, we'll end up at what we call the Woodhaven bench. Over a period of several years, I spent quite a few hours working on this trail, mostly digging into the hillside with a tool called a grub hoe. A grub hoe is something sort of like a pick that has one wide blade and the other blade kind of rotated and sharpened to be like an axe. And so you use the wide blade for digging dirt and pulling up rocks and pushing dirt around, and you use the other blade for chopping off roots, and you run into a lot of tree roots when you're digging into the hillside making a trail like this one. Along the way you see this large oak tree that has fallen, and if you look down in the gulch you'll see the other part of it. This was an interesting tree for many years because it stood there along the trail with a hole in it. It was quite hollow, and I used to put little sticks or stones in there just to see what would happen by the next time I came by, to see if they were disturbed, and sure enough they always were, which indicated that somebody was living in this tree while it was still standing. But then one day we came by, and there it was, all fallen down, laying down in the gulch. After a time of digging my way down into the hillside, down into the gulch, I stopped digging and started filling in the gulch. I installed a culvert there and started pushing and moving dirt and lined the sides with stones that I dug up along the way until this becomes sort of a bridge. The place where Spot is standing is kind of a dog leg. No, I don't mean her leg, but I mean a sharp bend in the trail where it doubles back and continues on down towards the lake. Here you see another view of the fallen oak tree, and when it first fell it was laying right across the trail, and it was kind of a job to scramble over it. So I got Steve to take his chainsaw and cut it off, and I sunk it into the dirt and made it part of the trail. We continue on down the hill to the west from here towards the lake. If you have a good imagination, you can take a look at the left side of the gulch down through here and imagine what it would be like to walk along that side instead of the right side, where I've cut the trail into a lot of sandstone outcropping here. Well, when I started this project, both sides of the gulch looked about the same. Well, we've made it back down to the water level again, and just around the corner from where the trail exits the gulch, you'll see this bench that I built one afternoon, and we call it the Woodhaven bench. I built this bench using pressure-treated lumber with stainless steel screws in hopes that it would last for a while, and then I used my router to freehand the name Woodhaven in the back of the bench. And here's the view you get when sitting on the Woodhaven bench. Off in the distance you can probably see the island we were looking at earlier from the beach. Let's do a quick review of where we are now on the map. We started out at the house, went down past the pole barn, went down to the beach, then we came back up past the brown bench again through the moss garden, past the big lightning strike oak tree, stopped to look at the view at the white bench, went down the trail, doubled around, crossed the stone bridge, and came out here by the Woodhaven bench, where we're sitting looking roughly in the direction that this arrow is pointing. If you look hard, just across the lake from the Woodhaven bench, you might see a strange pile of sticks and mud over there. And this is actually a beaver house, also known as a beaver lodge. A lot of the times you'll find beaver lodges built in the middle of a lake. But in this case, the water's too deep for that, so they built it on the side, and sometimes they're called bank beavers when they do this. Before the beavers constructed their lodge here, they actually built the lake itself. On either end of the horseshoe, for Horseshoe Lake, you'll find a fairly large beaver dam, fairly high that is, not real wide because this part of the terrain is fairly narrow. But they've dammed this up and built the lake, and then they build their lodge in the lake. Beavers are one of the few animals, besides man, that actually modifies the environment for their housing developments. Here's another picture of the beaver lodge taken about a week later. And if you have a good eye for detail, you might notice a subtle difference in the water out front of the lodge. You start seeing some sticks and branches sticking up out of the water. And actually what happens is that beavers do not hibernate or sleep during the winter, and they need a food supply all winter long. But the entrance to their lodge is under the water, so when the lake freezes over, they have no way to get out and go cut some twigs and eat the bark, which is their winter food supply. So in the fall, when the leaves fall, the beavers head up into the woods and they cut down trees and they start dragging branches as large as they can handle and dragging them down to the lake and floating them over and sticking them in the mud out front of the lodge. Sometimes, if the good wood, and they prefer aspen to other trees because it has a good fleshy bark, sometimes if that's a long ways from their lake or their lodge, they actually build a series of dams and canals between the lakes so that it's easier to transport their food supply. Sometimes the beavers might be dragging tree branches for as long as a mile from their lodge. Sometimes we refer to the Woodhaven bench as my meditation bench. It's nice to sit here and just watch the clouds go by and enjoy the wonders of nature. When we first got the Woodhaven property, the area right behind the Woodhaven bench was the scene of two very deep, eroded gullies, almost impossible to walk up through. But since I got the big blue tractor, I've been working on constructing a road from the pole barn down through the woods, and to this point I can get the tractor right above the Woodhaven bench here. Using both the backhoe and the front loader on the big blue tractor, I've dug into the hillside and excavated and filled in what used to be a deep gulch here. And I'm getting closer to my dream, which is eventually to be able to hook a little boat on behind the red tractor and pull it down here and launch it, and also add a floating dock out in front of the Woodhaven bench. But I have a lot of work to do because Mother Nature doesn't like my road, and every spring when the snow melts and the rains come, the water washes down here and erodes it again. At one point I installed some perforated drainage pipe before I backfilled in order to try to get some of the water out of there, because it makes the mud very wet and it tends to slump and slide. But I still have quite a bit of work to do before this project's completed. As we start up the boat road above the Woodhaven bench, we soon come upon this fallen tree. This one was cut down by the beavers. Once they've cut the tree down, they'll go to the other end of the tree and they'll start cutting off branches and dragging them down for their food supply. When the tree gets too big to be able to drag around, they'll consume as much of the bark as is useful to them right at the place. Now, some people are annoyed by the beavers and think they do a lot of destruction, but on the other hand, they built a nice lake for us, so I don't complain too much. Look up there at that big oak tree that's leaning over or leaning against another oak tree and would have fallen down if it wouldn't have got tangled in the branches there. What do you suppose happened to that one? You think the beavers cut that one down too? Not likely on a big oak tree like that. Usually the beavers don't go after big oak trees. Well, we did see that other tree that was smashed by lightning. Maybe this one was hit by lightning. We better investigate this a little closer. Well, look what we have here. The end of this log has been all charred, and it's been burned recently because some of the moss is green, but the moss near the charred end is brown. And all the leaves here and the twigs have been burned. It looks like we had a small forest fire here recently. How do you suppose that happened? Maybe the lightning, but wait a minute, that lightning strike that smashed that other tree was way back there on the hill. Could it be that it happened here too? Looking at the base of that big oak tree that's leaning over shows that it was actually hollow, but the inside is completely charred, and that burning is fresh. It looks like the fire that burned around here burned enough of that oak tree so that it finally just toppled over. We must have had quite a forest fire here lately. Actually, I first discovered signs of this fire a couple of weeks ago when I was out walking along the trail with some of our Sunday visitors. There had been some rain and drizzle both the night before and the day when we were taking the walk when we discovered the fire. And as we investigated some of the charred leaves and sticks, all of a sudden we spotted a column of flame shooting up. And we investigated a little closer, and a gas pipeline was on fire. So I hot-footed it back to the house and called the fire department, which is a volunteer fire department in this area. And they came out, and we also contacted the gas company. And the man from the gas company came out and used about 8 ounces of water in a water bottle to put out the fire, and then he slapped a patch on it. This gas pipeline, by the way, is running from some natural gas wells in the area to the main transmission lines, and along the way it does supply gas to heat the Woodhaven house. The gas carried by this pipeline is at a very low pressure, about 15 pounds per square inch, so it wasn't a very dangerous fire. And the fire, it turns out, was probably started by a cigarette butt from some passing hunter. It turns out that the Tuesday before the Sunday we discovered the fire, a neighbor had reported a lot of smoke and smoldering in this area, and the volunteer fire department came out and looked all around the area but could not find the fire. Because of the way the wind was blowing, they were not able to locate the source, and the fire was just smoldering in the leaves and not flaring up. So there you have the story of the Great Woodhaven Forest Fire of 2002. Passing near the site of the Great Fire of 2002, you find the Whitetail Trail. The Whitetail Trail starts in the woods behind the house and travels in a generally western direction, and it travels along until it comes to the intersection with the Bucktail Trail. Of course, I had to come up with names for all these trails. I find that if you don't have a name for something, you have a hard time talking about it. The Bucktail Trail is not a very highly improved trail compared to some of my other trails. It's still more or less a deer trail as it started out originally, but I can run my little tractor down through here every couple of years or so to keep the trees from growing back in. It goes up the hill until it reaches an area on the cliff above the north arm of the lake, passes through some piney woods, loops around and joins the trailing pine trail that we're going to cross in just a little bit. Continuing along the Whitetail Trail past its intersection with the Bucktail Trail, we move on up the hill and across a little flat area until we come to the intersection between the Whitetail Trail and the Trailing Pine Trail. At this point, we're looking generally in a southerly direction along the Trailing Pine Trail, and if we had a little more time, we could follow it down to the cliff above the north arm of the lake. Now we've turned around to look north along the Trailing Pine Trail, and this trail runs pretty much parallel to the western boundary of the property, although it's still a little ways down the hill before we get to the property line. The Trailing Pine Trail was named for a nice ground cover that's green year-round in this area. Of the end of the trail as shown in this picture is Dogwood Lane, and that's where we're headed for next. By the way, one of the nice things about Mother Nature is that she's never boring, and everything's always changing. And if you come back to the Trailing Pine Trail about a week or two later, it looks more like this. Here we've arrived at Dogwood Lane, and we're looking generally towards the west. And this is one trail that I did not have to build. This was originally an access road to some of the oil and gas wells that are back in the woods behind this area. Now we've turned ourselves around and we're looking back towards the east along Dogwood Lane. And if we continue up in this direction, we'll eventually come to the big field that's just to the north of the house. Wait a minute, Spot's not ready to go back to the house yet. She wants to take this branch off of Dogwood Lane, which is called the Tanger Loop Trail. So let's follow her and see what she finds. I've read that dogs have about 40,000 more sense organs in their nose than humans, and so she's picking up all kinds of interesting stories. Well, even though we can't smell the interesting stories, there are some things here to take a closer look at. For example, we could stop and admire some of these tiny bushy asters that bloom profusely in late summer. And if we look closely, we might find an occasional pale blue aster, or any of a variety of different late summer blooming members of the aster family. Here are a couple of stalks of goldenrod that have tumbled over and are laying near our trail. Usually we don't see it like this. Usually we see the goldenrod in open fields in great yellow clouds. Well, we've just about come all the way around the Tanger Loop, and just up over the edge of the hill there, we're going to break out into the field just north of the house. And on this day, some of the leaves are starting to show their fall colors. Usually the dogwood trees and the sourwood trees start by turning a kind of a bronze color that deepens towards magenta as time goes by. And if you look close in the trees back there, you might see some taller sumac trees with their clusters of fruit. A picture taken about a week later in pretty much the same location shows the dramatic changes in the color of the dogwoods and sourwoods, and now the maples are starting to turn a little bit also. Here's a close-up view of one of the dogwoods that shows some of the berries that are resulting from this year's flowers, and if you look closely, you'll also see the buds that have formed that'll make the flowers that'll bloom next spring long before the leaves come out. The summer of 2002 in central Ohio was much warmer than usual and drier than usual, and the leaves turned about 3 weeks later than usual. But it was worth the wait, because we had some very spectacular fall foliage in 2002. And so we've completed a big circle tour around the Woodhaven property and returned to the field just north of the house, from where we can see some nice maple tree foliage. There are actually 3 different kinds of maple trees in this picture. The yellow one on the left, in the center is a red maple, and on the far right, not yet showing its best colors, is a big sugar maple tree in the backyard. Well, this completes our fall 2002 tour of the wonderful world of Woodhaven. And I've hoped you've enjoyed watching it as much as I've enjoyed creating this little show.